Good morning and happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to this edition of Balance in Life, where we're going to talk about the importance of taking care of ourselves as we work very diligently to try to support our families, those that we work with, those that we serve, and start talking a little bit about this notion of secondary trauma. On behalf of the Virginia Cooperative Extension Human Development Program team, I'm Crystal Tyler Mackey with our partners from North Carolina Cooperative Extension, welcoming you to this session. Today's session is going to be led from our Chesterfield Prevention Services partners. Our specific presenter today is Ginger Dodder, and I am not going to take much time because there is a lot of content to be covered today. But as she's setting up, I will share with you that we will be engaging in the chat box as usual. So welcome if this is your first time or you've been on a lot. One quick note is that as you are engaging in the chat box, your first default will be to send your chat just to those of us who have, cameras that you can see. So that would be our speaker and then those of us who are supporting that work today. If you want everyone who's on today to be able to see your post, you need to choose all panelists and attendees, and that way other people who are in attendance can see your question or your great thoughts. So you have to do that intentionally in the chat box. So welcome, and I am going to step out of the way and turn things over quickly to Ginger. Welcome, Ginger.
Thank you so much. I am so glad to be here. So today we are going to talk about a topic called trauma stewardship. And so a lot of people might be wondering exactly what we're talking about when we mention trauma. I think quite often people think of trauma as, like the worst case scenarios, like a life-threatening injury or a life-threatening illness, or it could be abuse. Now, certainly that is, part of trauma, but we're talking about, a spectrum here. So we could be referring to something that's more of a person who is suffering in some way. It could be a job loss. It could be a divorce. It could be someone who has a history of anxiety, and in our current times that, maybe their anxiety is stirred up. And so maybe, that is somewhat traumatic on different levels. So when we're talking about trauma stewardship, we are talking about how do we handle this when we are exposed to other people's suffering. And I'm very passionate about this topic. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to define trauma stewardship for you, and we're going to talk about what are our responses to being exposed to other people's trauma. And then part 2 next week, we'll talk about creating change from the inside out. And then we'll talk about how to start to find your way. So we're talking about trauma stewardship. We're talking about, some of the impacts it may have on us that might, kind of get us off track. And so next week, we'll be talking more about how do we get ourselves back on track? Like, where do we start on that path of coming back to being more of the person who we are instead of all those maladaptive coping strategies? So, so basically, there's so much we could talk about with this. So this training actually comes from a book. The book is called Trauma Stewardship, and the book is written by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky. And in this book, she talks about her own experiences. She's worked in a variety of helping fields for a few decades now. And she talks about how, over time, she's been exposed to trauma again and again, to other people's trauma, that's secondary trauma. And so she found that she had taken it on as her own, and where she would go on vacation and it was still with her. One moment she's looking over this beautiful cliff at mountains and water, and she's just admiring the beauty. And the next moment she's wondering how many people may have jumped off of that cliff. So she could not just leave that behind. So she started to do some work, and that's where her work began with herself. And then that's kind of what led to, her writing this book. So we're going to define what is trauma stewardship based on her own definition. So it's a daily practice through which individuals, organizations, and societies tend to the hardships, the pain, trauma experienced by humans, other living beings, and also our planet itself. It's, by developing the deep sense of awareness needed to care for ourselves while caring for others in the world around us, we can greatly enhance our potential to work for change ethically and with integrity. And this can, this can kind of get that ball rolling in a positive direction for ourselves and those around us as well. So really a lot of what we're talking about today and next week is about finding a balance between being exposed to someone's trauma, but not making it our own. So where we can, continue to work with people and not take on their problems as our own. And I'm not talking about just working in a mental health field. I'm talking about, this could be someone that helps people find jobs, that they may hear these stories about, what has happened to a person since they've lost their job, about their family, about their own coping, that kind of thing. So this covers a broad spectrum of territory. So we're going to talk about what is the groundwork needed for trauma stewardship. So what we need to think about is ourselves right now. So often we get really focused on other people, especially if we find ourselves just consuming a lot of news, being online, listening to people talk about their stories. Sometimes we get really wrapped up in other people and we forget to take a look at ourselves. So for us to be able to handle all of this, the stress and that kind of thing more effectively, this is what we need to do. Doesn't mean it's easy, but this is what will help us be more effective with it. So the first one is learning to stay fully present in our experience. And you'll notice that the word in there is our experience, our own experience. So yes, we want to sit there and listen to a person who is sharing something with us. However, when that is over, when that conversation is over, we want to think about how did that affect us so that we know how to cope with that. But what happens quite often is that people often go from one situation to another situation, or they go through their whole day or week, a month, without really thinking about how does that affect them, your own self as a person. And then, but everything at the same time is building up. And then we have all this stuff we don't know what to do with, and we don't always even know where it comes from, not really specifically to one particular thing. So also we need to be willing to ask ourselves some questions. And one of those questions that's really important is, how am I different now after I've been exposed to this situation? To either witnessing something happen or to hear about something that's happened, having some type of exposure to someone else's suffering. So how are we different now? Because if we don't even realize what's different, then we don't really even know what we're working on, what we're working towards. So also we need to be willing to deal with our feelings. And that can make us feel really uncomfortable because sometimes, sometimes our ego might get in the way. It's like, well, or think, oh, I shouldn't have those feelings, or I shouldn't have thought that, or I shouldn't have done that. But we need to really think about, it's okay if we have certain feelings, thoughts, reactions. We're human beings. And so sometimes we might, tell ourselves, oh, I wasn't really anxious. But then you notice that you're shaking. And it's like, okay, something's going on there. So whatever you want to call it, however you want to define it, we need to deal with that to keep yourself healthy. So then also maintain compassion for yourself. Try not to be self-critical. My goodness, we're our own worst critics, aren't we? So we know that we need to really think about, if we're criticizing ourselves and being judgmental towards ourselves, does that lead us to also being critical of others? But what we know is that sometimes when we're criticizing ourselves, whether it's internally or externally, then that can interfere with how well we work with other people. So we also need to understand that nothing needs to change globally for us to alter our own experience. I think this one needs repeating. Let me say that again. Understand that nothing needs to change globally for us to alter our own experience. Wow. So that speaks volumes to me. a lot of times we're looking at other things, organizations, policies, practices within society. We're looking for all of these things to change. I work a lot with co-parents, and I say so often when I'm working with co-parents that, why do we sit back and wait for the other person to change? If we want to see change, we need to make some changes. It doesn't guarantee the other person will change, but maybe we need to change something about like how we set our boundaries, or maybe we change our expectations, or just something that we might need to do for ourselves to cope better with what it is that we can't really control. So then also remember that we have the power to choose our own path. But I think quite often for some people, it's really easy to get caught up in doing what the group is doing, or doing what you think is supposed to be right, but not really thinking about what are your needs and what would make you happy or help you cope more effectively. So those are, some of the things that we can consider when we're thinking about how can we be good stewards of trauma. So when we're exposed to a lot of negative things, like, certainly in today's times, there's a lot of negativity out there. There's a lot of stress. There are a lot of things going on in our world, of course. And I know I don't need to tell you that, but I'm just saying this is a time even more so that we need to stop and look at, how are we coping with this? We talk about, we hear all the time about, you can't pour from an empty cup. That, if, it's like also the analogy of, if you're in an airplane and you're going to crash, or, something's going on, you need to take the oxygen for yourself first, to help yourself first before you can help others. And when I'm talking about helping people, that might be in your job. That might be volunteer work. That might be, we were talking about parenting your children. But we need to make sure we're taking care of ourselves so that we can, do for others. So this next slide is something that really speaks to me. And I really like this quote. And I feel like I could do an entire day training on just this quote and really delve into it. But it says, we have an idea of happiness. We believe that only certain conditions will make us happy. But it is often our very idea of happiness that prevents us from being happy. Wow. So if you will, just put some of your thoughts in the chat box about what does that mean to you, or what does that make you think about? Some people might still be sitting there thinking about, just like the people in the picture, they might be thinking about, wait a minute, what does that really mean? So that sometimes we get really stuck in our idea of like how things need to be, that how things need to be for a person to be happy. So, but we know that life provides a lot of different avenues. Life provides a lot of changes. And so what can happen is we get off track. Sometimes we need to change our idea of what would make us happy. Some people, think about, at some point in their life, might think about success equals, one day I'm going to buy $1 million home. Well, what happens if they don't buy that $1 million home? What if their home is $150,000? What if their home is $250,000? Does that mean they'll never be happy? So sometimes we need to adjust what we think of as far as making us happy. And I'm not saying monetary things is really what we're talking about here. I just think that makes a really good example, a real concrete example. So, so sometimes we really need to stop and think about, what are we grateful for? And some people might be like, I don't know, I'm at a loss. And if that's the case, we need to stop and look for it. And sometimes we need to really look for it harder than other times. Okay. So do we have a second? I know we don't have time for a lot of feedback, but I'm curious to hear what some folks wrote in the chat box about their reaction to this quote.
I added a new quote to my quote box from Becky. Becky said, "Don't miss the good by looking for the perfect."
Wow, I love it. Wow, that's your own quote there.
That's from Becky shared that one.
I love it. That's awesome. I love it. Okay, so now we're gonna shift gears a little bit, and so continue thinking about what that means to you, and so that we can find our own happiness. Maybe we just need to shift a few things, our ideas or our ideals and that kind of thing. So we're going to move into talking about, what are some common responses to being exposed to someone else's suffering or trauma. So we know that there are different things that can influence how we respond. It can be the organizations where we work. It could be like the policies, or it could be like the climate of an organization. It could be society. It could be what's going on within our society. If we're really upset about certain things going on, then when we're communicating with someone that shares, like, whether it's about racism or about abuse that's, they feel like has been allowed to happen, then we might react to a person that's sharing those types of stories with us. And we might, have a little more emotion, or we might have more maladaptive ways of dealing with that. But certainly two huge factors in how we react would be our personal histories, and then us as individuals, what we're like as a person, our personality, our typical coping skills and things like that. So just to briefly mention, think about with personal history, we know that sometimes a person may react to a traumatic situation depending on whether or not they have had that same type of trauma or that same type of suffering or experience. So we know that, if even if a person has had that experience and they've dealt with it and they did it effectively and that kind of thing, and it's more like in their past, hearing it again, sometimes you hear it again, and all of a sudden here comes a bunch of stuff coming back that you need to deal with all over again. That's unfortunately part of life. And so that might just lead you into more of a negative place. And so we have to think about taking care of ourselves so we continue to help the other person in a more effective way. And then also, it could also give that person more insight because they've had those experiences. That doesn't mean a person that hasn't had that experience can't be helpful. It doesn't mean that they don't understand. We can still understand why they were thinking what they thought, or feeling what they felt, or acting in the ways that they did. But also, if you don't have that personal history, it might be a little easier to maybe keep more of a healthy boundary with that relationship with that person. All right, so we're going to talk about what are some common trauma exposure responses.
Excuse me, Ginger, before you move into the section, I just want to tell you, you have about 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so there's so many different reactions that we can have, but these are some of the most common ones that we see. And all of this, again, is from the book Trauma Stewardship, and it has many different, many other reactions listed in there as well. But we know that sometimes if we're exposed to situations, sometimes when we don't see improvement, or if there is improvement and we don't recognize it, then we might feel helpless, hopeless. And if that becomes more of a cycle or a place where we get stuck, then it might lead to a person thinking, why am I even going to work today? Nothing's going to work out. I can't really help people. The system is broken, whatever they might be thinking. It can be somewhat debilitating. And then also, we know that sometimes people feel like they can't do enough. Oh, there's not enough time in the day. There must be more that I can do to help a person. I can remember when I first started working in this field as a child and adolescent therapist, there were times when I would wake up in the middle of the night thinking about, there must be something else I can do to help this child. There must be something else I can do. And I had a lot of consultation with my supervisor and with coworkers about, what else can I do? And I eventually learned that there wasn't anything else that I could do. I was doing what I could. I was helping them cope with what had taken place. And so then also another response is anger, cynicism. And what can happen there is if we become angry, a lot of times we start to blame, whether it's a system, an individual, an organization, policies, our society, whatever it may be. And so we can get stuck into that blame game, and where it's someone else. But at that time, we're not really looking inward at, what can I do about that? Is it something I have control over? Is it something I don't have control over? Is there something I can contribute positively towards? Or do I just sit back and continue to be angry, which can lead into this really vicious cycle? And often what happens when people are angry about certain things, you know, whether it's an injustice about how people are treated or whatever it may be, a lot of times what happens is we end up taking out that anger on people that have absolutely nothing to do with it. And so they become our scapegoats, and that's not really fair. So sometimes people get so overwhelmed that they just shut down. They become numb. And I can remember having a conversation with one of my nurse friends years ago. And she told me about, you know, that there was probably a 2 or 3 month period where she realized that she was kind of numb. She was still doing her job and doing it well, but she wasn't really, she said she didn't feel like she was really providing patients with like that security they need. She worked in a hospital, and that she didn't really connect with them as much. She was just going through the motions. And so she was doing well as far as like the technical stuff with her job, but not so much with the personal part of it. And then sometimes we get to a point where we're like, that's it, I've had enough. And so people might avoid. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to avoid helping another person or doing their job, providing a service. Doesn't mean that they're going to stop, you know, being a volunteer or stop being a parent, avoid their kids, things like that. It might be that they avoid certain, you know, certain things. Maybe they kind of check out for a while at work during the day. Maybe they avoid more stressful situations. But when we get into that pattern of avoiding, it can be really hard to come back where you kind of face things head on. Some people get that sense of persecution. You know, they feel like they've got a target on their back, and, you know, they've got the black cloud, you know, following them and that kind of thing. And one big one we're going to talk about is guilt. So I really want to delve into guilt a little bit deeper. And there's a quote. It says, somewhere between internalizing an ethic of martyrdom and ignoring ongoing crises lies the balance that we must find in order to sustain our work. And that, again, that's a quote by Lipsky, the author of the book. And so basically she wants people to know that, you know, being happy is not a betrayal. But sometimes if we are helping a neighbor, if we are providing, if we're donating to like a Christmas fund, or, you know, whatever it is we're doing, sometimes we feel guilty for what we have and they don't. That could be monetary, that could be, you know, the support system and many other things. So it's really important to stop and think about, you know, if we feel guilty, what can we do with that? What can we do with that guilt? So we have to be careful, try not to take on, well, try not to allow that to alter yourself as far as feel ashamed for having, you know, for being successful, for, you know, what you have in your life, whether it, you know, whatever it may be, you know, your relationships and everything else. But sometimes guilt can actually interfere with the relationship with the person that you are working with, or doing things for, that kind of thing.
Excuse me, Ginger, you have about 4 minutes left.
Okay, thank you so much. So with the guilt, we just know that we have to really be mindful of how that's affecting us and potentially the relationship with a person that we're trying to be helpful to. All right, so what we're going to do is, so today we're going to stop here. And so this question mark is for us to think about, you know, we're getting ready to, you know, next week we're going to start to talk about where is our path. We're going to start to ask ourselves some questions about how does all this affect us? And then where do we begin our journey in trying to get back on a healthier path, or maybe a more effective path, something where you're not carrying around all of everyone else's stress, where you're not losing yourself, or you don't know where you end and another person begins. And so next week, Jennifer Hilliard's going to lead the talk, and I will be here in the chat box, but she'll lead the talk next week as well. So I wanted to see if we have any burning questions or thoughts. And if you have any, you can put them in the chat box.
Ginger, there's been great chat box feedback. One tip from Anita was to shift guilt to gratitude and then do something constructive with the feeling.
Oh, I love it. I love it. See, look, we're already thinking, aren't we? I love it. Awesome. Any more questions or thoughts to share?
There's also some thoughts related to the impact of media and social media on our experiences and feelings. So that's definitely true. And some good dialogue and suggestions related to intergenerational trauma and the transmission of trauma over time.
Yes, 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 yes.
It's a whole nother workshop, right?
I know some really great thoughts about this. And people are really thinking about this and I love it. Yeah. I can't wait to see what people are going to be thinking next week too when we dive into a little deeper.
I will say, Ginger, people were struggling with that concept a little bit about, and I do too, you know, it's a great point to be the change and don't wait for something else to cause you to change. And a lot of people were reacting to that and saying that it is hard to, it's easy to say that and it's something easy to get behind, but when you actually have to take action and do that yourself, it's challenging. So
it is. And that's one thing that we certainly acknowledge, that really change in general can be hard. But especially when we have multitudes of negative things coming our way, or if we have like a history of, you know, responding to trauma in unhealthy ways, it's hard to get out of that and make those changes. But we have to first recognize it, acknowledge it within ourselves before we can even do anything about it. So, yeah.
One more question out there, Ginger. It was around the guilt, the feelings of the guilt. So how do you, the question was around like acknowledging and dealing with you feeling that way. The question was, how do you maintain that, like shifting away from the guilty feeling? How do you maintain that?
Well, really, to maintain anything, you have to like make it a practice, you know, not just a one-time thing. So maybe, and I really love what one of the participants said about changing the guilt into gratitude. So instead of feeling guilty for, you know, you have this and someone else doesn't, then maybe you turn it more into, I am just so thankful. It makes me so much more thankful and appreciative of what I do have. So one thing I would recommend off the top of my head is just a gratitude journal, or just, you know, taking 5 or 10 minutes a day and just thinking about, what am I grateful for today? You know, it doesn't have to be something huge. It can be, today I am grateful that even though I had a migraine last night, I'm able to get out of bed and function this morning, you know? So sometimes we have to look for it. And sometimes we have to be really creative when we don't really see it. Well, great. Thank you guys so much for all your participation. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Crystal.
Thank you. Thank you, Ginger. Definitely a start. So we see you, we hear you in the chat that this is just a start, and there's so much more that we need to do in this space. And I will probably say that by the end of this session next week, you may be saying the same thing, but we did go ahead and schedule this as a part 1 and part 2. So if you have other people who want to come, no worries. We will send out the recording for anyone who didn't participate in part 1. Part 2 is, you know, it could be a standalone as well, but come back for part 2 so that we can continue this good conversation. And just acknowledge that, yeah, this is a start. This is a starting point. It's a where we are. So I know one of the things I'm taking away, Ginger, I just want to lift it up. One of the things I'm taking away is, you know, that notion of guilt. You know, I had to grapple with that myself at the start of this pandemic, when I realized all of the tools and resources that I now have in my current life. You know, both of us, my husband and I both kept our jobs, have good jobs, have solid jobs that could work from home, that could be here, that could help our children in remote schooling. They were doing well. You know, we weren't struggling. And I was grappling with some guilty feelings around that, you know, at the start of the pandemic. And I had to really get a grasp on, why am I feeling grumpy? Why am I feeling, you know, what is this about? And when I really got down to it, it was a feeling of guilt, of where we are and what we have relative to where so many other people were struggling. So I really appreciate you calling, you know, that out, and so many other great tips and lifting that up. So as we close out, again, part 2 next week, we'll be back here to dive a little bit further. When the recording is ready, we will send that out. For those of you who've been on before, you know we typically will send a slide deck. This time the slide deck will come after next week's session. So because they go hand in hand and pulled apart don't make as much sense as coming together. So but look for that recording link soon. And when we send out the recording link, we'll also send out the registration for next week. Having said that, I thank you, Ginger, for being on. Thank you, Melissa, for joining us as well. Bethany and Herman, as always. And for all of you, think about what we've talked about. And I'll just throw the gauntlet out there and say, if you aren't already doing something daily to think about what you're grateful for, start that this weekend. Let this be the starting point and see what that does for you. It's something I'll be intentional about doing myself. Thanks, everyone. I will see you next Friday. Have a great weekend. Bye.